Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from our hometown scrapbook. Here we go, The Dark Day. Hello there. This is the story that old-timers will recall with a chuckle, and probably most of you have heard something about it at one time or another. Those who lived during this day will have their own particular version of what happened. It's everyone's story. Our yarn happened back in September 1902. That was before the Aberdeen fire and about the time Frank Becker was bringing his Oldsmobile to Aberdeen to startle the horse and amaze the citizens. It had been a very dry summer and a drier autumn. The forest had been tinder for fires all season. The fires had licked at the standing timber and the slashes, first here and then there. But each time the humidity went up to the point where it discouraged fire, or some of the Grays Harbor mist materialized and squelched the flames. But early in September, the flames began to lick at the forest around the harbor, and there was no rain. The humidity remained at rock bottom, and things looked pretty black. Well, the state of Washington didn't have the Forest Service that they have today. And while the loggers would turn out to fight a fire, it was not on the scale that we know today. They cut fire lines or tried to hem the flames in, but their principal efforts were used in steering the flames into an area where they would burn themselves out without destroying too much timber. Moreover, forest fires were pretty common stuff. Trees grew so fast, and there was so much timber, that a few thousand acres burned didn't worry anyone, except maybe the company that owned the trees. So the fires burned brighter, and the smoke got thicker, and the sun shone hot and red through the haze of smoke that hung over the entire Northwest. That was the way things looked on the 11th of September 1902, which was the day before tonight's events occurred. Well, September 12th, 1902, was the big day of this yarn. But before we get to telling of it, let's make a spot for Dick Crombie and a few words from our sponsor. Now, we said that the 11th of September was a smoky day, and so it was. The clouds of smoke rolled over the harbor all day long and settled in thick, opaque layers. Sometimes cinders showered down, cold, black, and hot. Citizens of Grays Harbor eyed the sky and complained about the fires, but very few of them worried about the millions of feet of old-growth timber and the countless millions of seedling trees that were going up in smoke. As we said, people just didn't worry much about forest fires in those days. In fact, not so many years before that, there had been a well-circulated theory that our forests couldn't burn. We had too much rain, we were told. These were the rainforest, and this was the rain belt. So here were forests that were as good as asbestos. They would grow, be harvested, grow and be harvested, and so on indefinitely, and no fires or pestilence could ever touch them. One Eastern publication predicted that the Olympic Peninsula could provide all the timber used in America forever. That was a broad view that they took of such things. Well, that was the way things looked on the night of September 11th when people in the little harbor cities went to bed. Smoky overcast, a red sun, and the little towns folded up for the night. And so the clocks ticked away the night hours, and in the cold gray dawn, when Grays Harbor Mills got up to face another day on the green chain or the slab cart, the mills started at 7 o'clock in those days. The alarms jingled and announced the hour. It was still dark at 6. Though, by all odds, it should have been the first minutes of daylight. The mill workers, with their lunch buckets under their arms, hiked off to work at 6:30, and still the darkness hung low and heavy. Later risers, who snapped their alarms off at 7, were surprised to see it still dark, and not a few of them rolled over and swore mentally at the unpredictability and undependability of clocks and went back to sleep. If they slept an hour, as some did, it was 8 when they next looked at their clock and it was still dark. Now, the first reaction of most people was to complain about their clocks, but of course, where a household had 2 or more of the little tickers, they soon got around to comparing them. They noticed that all the clocks told the same time, but it was still dark. Then they visited the neighbors. That provided the information that the neighbors had also noted the deficiency in their timepieces, and of course, when they began to compare notes, it was all clear to them. There was going to be no daylight on September 12th. At least, not when it should come. Well, the realization came slowly to most folks. The illusion of night was complete. Street lights stayed lit, and in the houses, mills, and stores, the lights burned as though everyone was on night shift. Some of the mills never started, and others that did turn their wheels slowed down to a halt before the morning was very old. In some homes, candles and lamps sputtered ineffectually. You see, the number of homes with electric lights back in 1902 was pretty small. At that time, students gathered in small groups, and the faculty wondered what to do with them, finally sending them home. There were, of course, no adequate lights in most classrooms. Principal Harris at the Old Terrace Heights School in Aberdeen collected his faculty on the steps of the building and talked it over. No one could decide what to do. Finally, they decided to do nothing. At 11 o'clock that morning, the sky was still as dark as pitch, and the chickens were still on their roost. And by this time, some of the folks of town had decided that the end of the world had finally caught up with them. Yes, then as now, someone was always predicting that the end of the world was about to visit us, and a lot of folks figured that this was it. And many of the people who didn't really believe that this was the day of judgment still weren't sure just what to expect of the day, with the result that a wave of piety varying from just plain soul-searching to frenzied demonstration of religious zeal broke out. Men who had gone to work walked off the job with a why work at the end of the world kind of attitude. One Sealot hauled most of his possessions out into the backyard and began to burn them in a pile, shouting and praying the while in a high-pitched voice. Another gathered together most of his possessions and stopped people passing by his house to give them away as gifts. Things like that were happening. They might need 'em more than me, and if this is the end of the world, I don't need 'em. One of the religious organizations held a street corner meeting and played to a packed house. Knots of citizens gathered here and there amongst the main streets of Aberdeen, Hoquiam, Cosmopolis to compare notes, and noon showed up on the town clocks. Well, about noon, the sun, which was up above the cloud of smoke all the time, found a little hole in the overcast and slanted a beam right straight down through the darkness onto Aberdeen. It was a red ray that looked as a tongue of flame, and the sun looked as though it was through the layer of smoke, seemed to be a red-hot ball of fire hanging in the space over the city. Some folks looked up at it and smiled reassuringly to themselves. It was all clear now. But to others, it was the finger of fate, a flaming scarlet finger that was heralding an angel of doom or some other such phenomenon. And for a terrible moment they waited for the trumpets to blow and the descent of the celestial figures from the heavens to the earth. However, at noon that day, most folks turned off their lights and went about their business, stopping only in a while to hear the latest story of what some citizens had done when they thought that the hour of doom had crept over and caught up with Grays Harbor. And as the afternoon wore on and the gray smoke grew thinner and the day became about as overcast as it had been the day before, afternoon winds helped, and soon the sun set, leaving a red glow on the horizon, and a Grays Harbor that had at least been reassured that all was right with the world. The next morning saw most of the folks up again at the crack of dawn to see if they were going to have a repeat performance of the phenomenon, but no such luck. The daylight crept across the marshes in its old familiar pattern. The alarms went off to the tune of just an ordinary day, and when workers started for the morning shift, it was just another Grays Harbor dawn, a little damp and misty, a smell of forest fire smoke in the air, and the customary sounds of a waterfront city getting ready for the toil of a long day ahead. That was it, the dark day of 1902. Now, Dick, a few words from our sponsor. Well, that was the famous dark day of 1902. It was easy enough to explain if you knew what had happened. Grays Harbor wasn't experiencing what Pittsburgh used to go through in much the same way, almost every day for the next year. The heavy clouds of smoke from the burning forest were carried over the harbor and mixed with the morning fog. There was no wind to blow them away that morning, and the layer became so thick that the sun's rays wouldn't penetrate it. So there it lay, a blanket of smog over Grays Harbor, and hours meant nothing to it. Once it had lifted, there was no harm done except for the fellow who had burned his possessions or the ones who gave them away to strangers to clean house for the day of judgment. But it gave Grays Harbor quite an insight into its citizens. Neighbors got to know each other better. The churches and religious leaders had had an insight into the way that most of the citizens felt about themselves. And when old-timers recall the dark day of 1902, they remember first how it felt to face a day that was really a night, or should have said a night that was really a day. Anyhow, they remembered what happened to them, and then get a chuckle out of all the stories that grew out of the dark day, the personal experience of neighbors, old folks praying in the streets, of mill crews going home, and stores failing to open, of the street lights burning at mid-morning, and the excitement and relief that came over Grays Harbor when the sun really broke through and daylight came filtering down through the haze to return the lives of our little communities back to normal. That was the history maker, the dark day of 1902, and the day that rates a full page in our hometown scrapbook. Thank you for listening.